Hey folks, this is Kelani. I briefly talked about the idea of different WoW expansions doing better or worse depending on when they release due to this TikTok idea. This was in a video fairly recently. One expansion is a tick or a good expansion, while the next expansion is a tock or a bad expansion. Just like a clock, our expansions will go from tick to tock and back to tick again. While we don't have any proof that this is indeed the case or is planned in any way, shape or form, depending on how Blizzard actually tackles their development process, it might just be an unfortunate coincidence which is being caused by something unintentionally. No matter how or why this curiosity comes into being, it definitely seems to hold some weight as you look at the storyline of World of Warcraft and each expansion in turn. All of this leads us to ask some very important questions. Is Battle for Azeroth a filler expansion? Are we just on the tock side of this development process, and will we have to wait for the next expansion to swing us back over to the tick side before things start getting better? Let's have a look at what might be impacting the reception of WoW expansions so we can try and answer those questions. So how much do we really trust this tick-tock theory? Let's bring up the expansions and go back through them. So the last expansion was obviously Legion, which was very well received and highly praised for the most part. That's a tick. One step back from that, we have Warlords of Draenor, which is where a lot of subscribers suddenly disappeared and when Blizzard actually stopped publicly announcing how many subscribers WoW was maintaining. It's also an expansion which saw huge content cuts and we only really ended up with one main patch before a very long stretch of no content before Legion finally arriving. Definitely a tock expansion. Before that, we had Mists of Pandaria, and while this one got off to a bit of a shaky start, it ended up being a very successful expansion and is often looked up to for its class design choices. It might just be rose-tinted glasses or the BFA circle jerk, but I've seen a lot of people say Mists of Pandaria was when they had the most fun actually playing their characters, thanks to great class and spec design. So that one's a tick right there. Before that we had the Cataclysm, which I thought did pretty well, but I think they bit off a bit more than they could really chew with the old world redesigns, and that left endgame lacking quite a bit. The general consensus seems to be that Cataclysm was a disappointment, so that would follow with the tick-tock pattern. Wrath of the Lich King was also the pinnacle of WoW's popularity, so you can't really argue that Wrath was a tick. Now, I have seen some people push back against the TikTok theory by saying things like, well, the Burning Crusade was an amazing expansion, so TikTok doesn't fit at all, and you could be right. The Burning Crusade was very enjoyable for a lot of people, but I do remember a lot of complaints too. Perhaps what's more important here, though, is that the TikTok theory might actually be a fairly new thing. Cataclysm, or even the Warlords of Draenor, could have been the first real TOC expansion, but to get into that we'll have to look into what might be causing one expansion to do really well and the next to do so poorly in comparison. One of the big topics that I've come across a lot while researching this is the idea that World of Warcraft has two teams, the A team and the B team. While the A team works on the Mists of Pandaria, the B team is getting Warlords of Draenor ready to ship. When Warlords releases, the A team then starts work on Legion, and it keeps going on like that. So one team is responsible for one expansion and then the other team is responsible for the next. That means the Battle for Azeroth might be the same team that delivered the Warlords of Draenor expansion, which might explain a few things if they didn't learn too much from the last expansion they brought to the table. If that's the case, then the A team will be working on the next expansion right now, and it might be super awesome because it's the same team that came up with Legion. And you might be asking, well, why would they split the workload like that? Why would they be working on the next expansion if the current one isn't doing so well? Doesn't it make more sense to focus all of your resources and effort into the current expansion? If you're asking those questions, I might have a bit of a surprise for you. The dev teams will have more than the next few steps in mind. They'll be working more than one expansion ahead. We're just about to get our hands on patch 8.15, but patch 8.2 will be more or less finished and ready to test sometime very soon. Patch 8.25 will already be fleshed out for the most part. Patch 8.3 will be at the very least have all its bits and pieces figured out, and they might even know what the pre-patch event for the next expansion is going to look like. On top of that, the next expansion will have its major plot points already set, work will probably have started on building the zones and areas we'll be exploring, and they know what each patch is going to focus on. But they'll have more information past that. They'll most likely know how that expansion is going to end and where the story goes from there. We know they plan these things way in advance. During Mists of Pandaria, they were deciding whether Warlords of Draenor or Legion should be the next expansion, so they already had both of those two figured out in Mists of Pandaria. It makes sense with this kind of thing to know where you want to go and how you want to tell the story so you're never stuck scrambling around in the dark, desperate to get something else out very quickly. But it also makes sense to split up the workload to make sure you always have something in the pipeline. Back before Warlords of Draenor, we heard that the WoW dev team was being expanded quite significantly to help pump out more content at a faster pace. Never again will we have to deal with a dreaded content drought at the end of every expansion. We'll have consistent updates with plenty of content to keep us busy. They were even working towards a 1-year expansion cycle, so we would get a whole new expansion every single year. Personally, I don't really fancy forking over $60 a year plus the $15 per month we already pay, especially if each expansion was half of the content of what we're getting right now with a 2-year cycle, but that was their plans going forward from Warlords of Draenor. Obviously, that backfired quite badly because Warlords had maybe a year's worth of content, which was stretched out pretty thinly, but the reason for that was the increased size of the dev team. It didn't allow them to create more content faster as they may have expected. Just because you add another 3 devs onto a project, that doesn't mean it will get finished faster. Sometimes that can actually cause hefty delays in a project, as you have to get everyone up to speed and on the same page before you can really make any progress at all. But the larger dev team eventually allowed them to make more content, but in the same amount of time. So instead of making 1 patch in a few months, they could make 1 in a bit. This means they will constantly be working ahead of the current content cycle, even into the next 2 expansions. But why does that leave us with a TikTok cycle? Well, if it's true that 2 separate teams are working on alternating expansions, maybe one team just isn't as good as the other. Maybe the A team really is the cream of the crop, so to speak, while the B team just sort of gets stuff done until the A team gets another crack at it. If that's how it actually is, that's pretty disappointing, but it's not all too far-fetched when you really think about it. So we might just be stuck with a B team for now, and the next expansion will be when things start to pick up again because the A team will take the reins again, and then we'll go back to the B team, and so on and so forth. But that doesn't mean we'll be stuck with the TikTok cycle forever. Battle for Azeroth isn't really the same as Warlords of Draenor, which is the best example of a really bad tock expansion we have. Warlords wasn't all that bad at the start, but no new content was added for such a long time that everyone just got bored. When content finally came our way, it was the last patch of the expansion. That really baffled people. They cut out so many different pieces of story and content that we were supposed to get and just raced to the finish by releasing Hellfire Citadel. They completely abandoned the expansion in favour of getting Legion into our hands, which might have actually been the right call if I'm honest with you, because Legion really ignited the spark for World of Warcraft again, but it doesn't look like they're abandoning Battle for Azeroth like they did with Warlords. I think BFA might actually be more like Cataclysm for a few reasons. Cataclysm took some pretty big risks, which didn't pay off in the long run. They revamped the entire old world, and while that was a huge undertaking, which definitely refreshed the leveling experiences for 1 to 60, it didn't do anything for the endgame in Cataclysm, which is where the majority of players would have been wanting to spend their time. Max level has always been the real World of Warcraft since the Burning Crusade. If you're not playing the current expansion's content, then you're just behind the curve. I think BFA took a few risks as well, even though they didn't really look like risks at the start. They simplified the artifact system and introduced a lot of content which was very accessible. World quests were a huge hit in Legion. They allowed anyone to get out in the world and get something meaningful done. Anyone could do them and everyone was rewarded for taking part. That's not a bad model to try and replicate. Island expeditions work in the same way. Anyone can do them and everyone is rewarded for taking part. But they also introduced a few other elements into the mix. You have to play with other people. You can't go at your own pace. You're almost expected to do them depending on how you feel about weekly quests and artifact power, and there's a weird PvP-ish scenario forced onto you. The rewards are also entirely randomized, and the entire reward system was hidden behind a curtain for the first few months. That doesn't really add up to a great time. The same can be said for Warfronts. Anyone can take part in them, everyone is rewarded for participating. Even if they're AFK. If you can AFK and get full rewards in a Warfront, you can bet your left boot that people will try and get away with it. And they did. Warfronts also shoehorned you into going at the dev's pace instead of allowing you to take control of the battlefield. You're a bystander watching the story unfold, you're not really a driving force in the story itself. These types of content might not seem particularly risky, but they take away dev time from other gameplay options, and all three systems, the new artifact, islands, and Warfronts, definitely haven't paid off in Battle for Azeroth. The dev team lost this bet, which is very different from not bringing anything to the table in the first place, which is like what happened with Warlords of Draenor. I'm actually very surprised and very happy that they aren't abandoning Battle for Azeroth. I think they can still do great things with this expansion and the story that's being set up in this very next patch. They're leaving Warfronts behind while giving us a few other options to try and enjoy them, like the heroic mode, and they're completely redesigning the artifact system again later on. The Heart of Azeroth is going to work very differently in patch 8.2, so there's a good chance we can enjoy the rest of Battle for Azeroth, even if some people call it a filler expansion. Personally, I think BFA probably is a tock expansion, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. If TikTok is a real thing and this is all by design, at least this tock expansion is quite a bit better than the last tock expansion. That means that the tocks might be getting closer to the ticks, even if one ends up being better than the other every single time. The difference between tick and tock is getting smaller. Whether that's a case of the B team getting better at what they do, an equal amount of time being spent on all expansions, or just winning the bets when they play a little risky, consistently good expansions will only ever be a good thing. So yeah, Battle for Azeroth might be a bit of a filler expansion, but I think we'll still have a great experience as we get closer and closer to the next expansion. Patch 8.2 promises to be awesome. Hopefully patch 8.3 sets the stage beautifully for another amazing World of Warcraft expansion. I'll keep my fingers and toes crossed. I hope you'll all do the same. What do you think about Battle for Azeroth being called a filler expansion? Do you buy into the TikTok theory, or do you think it's just a bunch of baloney? Leave all your thoughts in the comment section below. A big thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon. You can see their names floating by on screen. If you want to join these lovely guys and gals, you can find a link in the description below. Remember to leave a like just below the video before you leave. If you want to see more, make sure to subscribe. But apart from that, thanks for watching folks, good luck and have fun, and as always I will see you next time.